Imagine you are the most powerful man on the planet. You have shattered every army sent against you. Your name alone makes kings tremble and generals sweat. You have rewritten the map of Europe, humiliated Prussia, crushed Austria, and brought Russia to the negotiating table. You are Napoleon Bonaparte, and you are untouchable. And then you make one decision. One single decision that starts a slow, grinding, bleeding nightmare you will never fully wake up from. That decision? Spain. Welcome back to History Vale. Today, we are diving deep into the conflict Napoleon himself reportedly called his greatest blunder. The Peninsular War, the invasion of Spain in 1808. The war that did not end in a glorious triumph or a signed treaty on a grand table. It ended in guerrilla ambushes, mass executions, starving French soldiers, and a 6-year drain on the most powerful military machine Europe had ever seen. If you want to understand how empires fall, you have to understand Spain. To understand why Napoleon marched into Spain, you have to understand the world he was building. By 1807, Napoleon had essentially transformed continental Europe into a French-controlled sphere. His Continental System, a massive economic blockade designed to strangle Britain by cutting off its trade with Europe, was the cornerstone of his grand strategy. Britain was his one undefeated enemy, the thorn he could never remove, and the sea made a direct invasion nearly impossible after Trafalgar. So Napoleon decided to strangle them economically instead. The problem was Portugal. This small nation on the Iberian Peninsula had deep historic ties with Britain and refused to comply with the blockade. Napoleon could not allow that. He needed the entire European coastline sealed. So in late 1807, with the cooperation of Spain, French troops marched through Spanish territory and occupied Portugal. That part went smoothly. But Napoleon, being Napoleon, could not leave well enough alone. Spain at the time was ruled by King Charles IV, a weak, easily manipulated monarch, and his son Ferdinand, who was locked in a bitter power struggle with his own father and with the deeply unpopular chief minister Godoy. The Spanish royal family was, to put it diplomatically, and Napoleon saw an opportunity. In the spring of 1808, Napoleon summoned both Charles and Ferdinand to Bayonne, just across the French border. What followed was one of the most cynical pieces of political theater in modern history. Napoleon pressured Ferdinand to give up his claim to the Spanish throne, then pressured Charles to abdicate as well. Within weeks, Napoleon had replaced the entire Spanish royal family with his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, who was plucked from the throne of Naples and dropped onto the throne of Spain. On paper, this looked genius. Napoleon now controlled the Iberian Peninsula completely. Portugal was occupied. Spain had a French king. Britain's last allies on the continent were neutralized, except Napoleon had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed the Spanish people would simply accept this change, the way other European peoples had accepted French influence. He was wrong, devastatingly wrong. On the 2nd of May, 1808, the people of Madrid rose up against French troops. It was not organized, not planned, not led by generals or politicians. It was ordinary people with knives, muskets, and sheer fury, taking to the streets against one of the most battle-hardened armies in the world. The French suppressed it brutally. Marshal Murat ordered mass executions. Hundreds of Spaniards were shot in the streets. Francisco Goya would later immortalize those massacres in two of the most haunting paintings in Western art. But the executions did not end the resistance. They ignited it. The uprising spread across the entire country like wildfire. In city after city, in village after village, Spaniards formed local resistance committees called juntas and declared war on France. This was not a war being fought by a standing army following orders from a capital. This was a nation in revolt, a people's war, and it introduced Napoleon's forces to a style of combat they were completely unprepared for. The word guerrilla itself comes from this war. It means little war in Spanish, and it perfectly captures what the French faced. Rather than meeting the Grande Army on an open battlefield, where French tactical genius could shine, Spanish fighters melted into the mountains, the valleys, the cities. They hit supply lines, assassinated couriers, ambushed small columns, then vanished before a proper response could be organized. French soldiers who ventured out alone or in small groups simply disappeared. Roads that were safe one day became death traps the next. For French generals trained to fight conventional battles, this was maddening. You cannot defeat an enemy who refuses to stand and fight. You cannot occupy a country when every civilian could be a combatant. The French responded with increasing brutality, burning villages, executing suspects, taking hostages. This only deepened the hatred and fueled more resistance. It became a vicious cycle with no exit. And then Britain arrived. The British, who had been watching Spain erupt with considerable interest, sent an expeditionary force under a relatively unknown general named Arthur Wellesley, who would go down in history as the Duke of Wellington. Britain now had exactly what it had always needed: a land base on the continent with a willing local population to support operations. The British Army, small but professional and brilliantly led, combined with Spanish guerrillas and regular Portuguese forces to create a nightmare coalition for the French. Wellington fought a methodical, patient war. He did not try to conquer France. He simply kept pressure on, won key battles like Salamanca and Vittoria, kept French forces tied down, and allowed the guerrilla war to do its grinding work. Napoleon was forced to keep hundreds of thousands of his best troops pinned in Spain, troops he desperately needed elsewhere, especially as relations with Russia deteriorated. The Peninsular War was bleeding France white, not in one dramatic hemorrhage, but in thousands of small cuts every single day. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate that France lost somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 soldiers in the Peninsular War. Some estimates go higher. Spanish civilian casualties were enormous. Entire regions were depopulated. The economy of Spain was shattered. Cities were looted, churches burned, centuries of art and culture destroyed. This was not a clean Napoleonic-style campaign with a decisive battle and a tidy peace treaty. It was years of attrition, misery, and hatred. Napoleon tried multiple times to personally take command and sort out the mess. In late 1808, he marched in himself with a massive army and forced his way to Madrid within weeks. For a moment, it seemed like his personal touch might stabilize the situation. But even Napoleon could not be everywhere at once, and the moment his attention shifted to Austria in 1809, the guerrilla war reignited and Wellington returned. The situation never truly stabilized. What made the Spanish campaign so devastating for Napoleon was not just the soldiers it consumed, but the legitimacy it destroyed. The Napoleonic Empire was built on the myth of invincibility, on the idea that Napoleon's judgment was infallible, that French arms were unstoppable. Spain cracked that myth in public, in front of all of Europe. Other nations took note. If Spain could resist, perhaps resistance was possible elsewhere too. By 1813, Wellington's forces had pushed the French back across the Pyrenees. Joseph Bonaparte fled Spain. The country that Napoleon had thought he could casually hand to his brother had instead handed him 6 years of unwinnable war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and a template for national resistance that would inspire independence movements across his entire empire and beyond. Napoleon would later, in his exile on St. Helena, reflect on Spain as the fatal wound. Not Waterloo, not Russia, Spain. Because Spain started before Russia. Spain was still bleeding when Russia happened. Spain tied down the troops, drained the treasury, undermined the myth, and stretched an empire that was already being asked to do too much. The Peninsular War is one of the great lessons of military and political history. It shows that occupying a country is not the same as controlling it. It shows that a population that refuses to accept defeat cannot be truly defeated by force alone, only made more determined. It shows that even the greatest military genius in the world can be undone by arrogance, by assuming that because something should work on paper, it will work in reality. Napoleon saw Spain as a small problem with an obvious solution. The Spanish people showed him and the world that there is no such thing as a small war when an entire nation decides to fight back. That is it for Day's Deep Dive here on History Veil. If this video gave you something to think about, hit that like button because it genuinely helps the channel grow and lets us keep making content like this. Subscribe if you are new here, because we cover history's most pivotal turning points exactly like this every week. Drop a comment below telling me which Napoleonic campaign you want us to cover next. Was his Russian disaster even worse than Spain? Let me know. The debate is always better when you are part of it. Until next time, this is History Veil, and history never stops being worth understanding.